A little bit more about me. I'm Chief Executive of Food and Drink Federation in Scotland, but also part of the UK Food and Drink Federation. So for me, this is a value deal. You'll get two for the price of one. You'll get a little bit about the UK and a little bit about Scotland. I'll talk about what the food and drink industry wants in the UK, some of the angles on that in Scotland, and then some musings about politics and the process if we've got enough time. So the Food and Drink Federation in the UK is the largest food and drink trade manufacturing association. We have members from international companies to some of the biggest brands. So a huge amount of the turnover of UK food and drink manufacturing is represented by us at a UK level. In Scotland, I have a very wide portfolio as well. So we go from traditional Scottish products like shortbread, porridge, and so on. But we also have innovations in terms of Genius and gluten-free and lots of other innovative companies in there as well. So a huge range in the different types of business that we have there. So let's start with the United Kingdom perspective. This is Ian Wright, who's the Director General of the Food and Drink Federation in the UK. Ian loves a quote, and this is one of his. And one of the things that we're dealing with at a UK level is trying to up the food and drink industry's profile with politicians and to try and get them to understand the necessity and importance of the food and drink industry in the UK. And it's not quite seen as important as some of the other industries like aerospace, like defence, all of which added together don't add up to what the food and drink industry contributes to the UK. So we've got a tough gig there. As you can see, Ian is speaking there with the NFU and NFU Wales, and we've tried to create alliances with our partners in retail, in farming, in fisheries, and also with the other trade associations. So as John said, we were quick off the block with a plan for Brexit, and we've been quick on the block in creating partnerships. At the moment, we convene a monthly group of trade associations. There are 45 different trade associations that come to that, working with the UK government, lots of different departments in the UK government, to consider a huge amount of these Brexit issues. So, what do we think the food and drink industry in the UK has to get from Brexit? Well, the first and most important, obviously, is access to EU workers. Then we go on to trade, regulation, standards, an open border in Ireland, and clarity over transitional arrangements. And I'll talk a little bit about some of these angles first from a UK perspective. So the figure is staggering. Of our most recent survey, 34% of the 400,000 people employed in UK food manufacture alone are from the European Union. And we're already seeing an impact of Brexit in those companies. Food and drink is always an area where we have problems filling vacancies, but that has been exacerbated by this. So manufacturing and EU workforce is our key priority for multiple reasons. Number one, who's going to make the food? But number two, that 34% of employees are highly valued within the food and drink industry. They do a range of jobs at all skill levels, and they're an integral part of the makeup of the food industry in Scotland, in the UK, sorry. A busy slide, but essentially future trade with the EU is of critical importance. From those stats, you'll see that the UK is only 60% self-sufficient in food. We import 70% of our stuff from the European Union, and hearing from Paul Kelly earlier on shows the importance of that trade to Ireland as well. And also, and critically for many of our members, we have access to free trade agreements with third countries in the EU, and we're really keen to make sure that we keep those going forward as well. Otherwise, we'll have to create them ourselves. So trade is a significant issue, and you might enjoy the figure there of 13,608 separate tariffs on biscuits if you're not a member of the European Union, which you have to work out for yourself and work out the tariff that's there. So that kind of impact is one that obviously our manufacturers who are trying to compete want to avoid. Food safety and security and regulation. I think Paul mentioned earlier on there were 2,000 different pieces of regulation around food. When I talk about Scotland, I'm going to make it even more complicated. But at the moment, just think about that. And obviously, we have no real expertise in the UK in creating food regulation on its own. We've been working very closely with colleagues in Brussels and in other places on all of this for many, many years. Also, you'll see that the UK government has committed to no reduction in food safety or quality standards for consumers, and indeed quite often talk quite heavily about how they might increase animal welfare standards in the UK. And obviously we need to understand how that impacts on profitability and the opportunity for our businesses. And again, if you're from the EU and trading into the UK, again, they're beginning to talk therefore about regulatory divergence already. Ireland is obviously critical. It's critical for two reasons. The first is the reason of trade that we've talked about already this morning, and the reason of cross-trade of both exports and imports. So that's of significant importance, but also it is politically important given the high level of importance put upon it by the EU negotiators. It's one of the three things that needs to be sorted out before wider negotiations about future trade deals can be put in place. So it's a significant issue for us, and of course Ireland will be a critical test case for future trade arrangements given the massive amount of food that goes back and forward over the border. And of course we know, and you'll have heard I'm sure, of companies that single ingredients go from manufacturing in sites in Northern Ireland to the Republic of Ireland multiple times in the creation of a single product, all of which are potentially affected by these border issues. The other thing to talk about is transition. As John said, we've welcomed some tentative noises from the UK government about the need for a transition period, which is, I think, a reality, whether the politicians like to agree with that or not. But we need to know what those interim arrangements will cover. We need to know how long any interim arrangements will last. We need to be sure that there's only one change of circumstances we need to adapt to, and we need to know as early as possible to help our planning. One of the things to think about in terms of transition is many a transition deal ends up being the deal. People just accept that becomes the status quo and moves on. So this transition deal has to even think about those kinds of consequences in play. So that's kind of a quick run through some of the UK positions, but a lot that I hope you've heard me say is very much in line with what Paul was saying earlier on. We want simplicity, we want clarity, we want free trade as much as can be possible, and we want to be sure in particular that we can rely on European workers in the food and drink industry in the UK. So now, the second part of your 2-for-1 deal is around Scotland, our First Minister there in a victorious pose. So John gave you some of the stats earlier on. Food and drink is significantly more important to the Scottish economy than it is to the UK economy. In Scotland, we represent 19% of the Scottish manufacturing workforce, rather than about 15 or 16% at the UK level. So it's different. It's also treated differently by government. The Scottish government sees it as a key priority sector. And if you'll see, in general, our exports and our growth has been quite stratospheric in Scotland over the last 10 years. Lost my click, there we go. We've just recently been working quite heavily on that in partnership. So that's me somewhere standing at the back there with the First Minister and various other worthies, launching our Ambition 2030 project. Our Ambition 2030 project is an opportunity to double the turnover of the food and drink industry in Scotland by 2030. So from around 15 billion just now to 30 billion by 2030. In general, it ignores Brexit. We're trying to think ahead for all the many changes that have happened, and we launched our last strategy in 2007, just before the financial crisis, just before the collapse of the banks, and managed to break that quite easily. So we're confident and positive. And what you have there is working together across the food chain. So in this picture, You have Scotland Food and Drink, ourselves at FDF Scotland, but you have the National Farmers Union of Scotland, you have the Scotch Whisky Association, you have the research institutes and others, and you also have the public sector. So you have the Scottish Government and our enterprise agencies and export agencies all represented there, all backing a single plan, all working to the same sets of goals. So that's a key thing that is a difference in Scotland that we're able to deliver, which is different from the UK picture, which is much more fragmented and much less easy to see where government support sits. I'm having problems with my clicker. There we go. So a little bit about Scottish politics, and this is where things get very much more complicated. We have, of course, an electorate that voted to remain. We have always the independence question. Should Scotland be an independent nation? Should it be an independent nation within Europe? How does that play? And up until May, June this year, we thought that we were on a path to another very quick independence referendum in Scotland. The First Minister had set out our plans. There was nothing really stopping her make that happen, with the Brexit vote being the catalyst for that. Strangely, the UK election has been a disaster for the Tories everywhere except in Scotland, the most paradoxical of places. So we've gone from an SNP driven majority of MPs in Scotland. We had all but one MP were SNP, to now a resurgence in the Tories, both in the Scottish Parliament and in Westminster. The SNP in the Scottish Parliament no longer have a majority. They've got a functional majority with the Greens, and the SNP in Westminster are still the largest party, but now they have a substantive opposition of about 15 Tory MPs from a wipeout previously. So paradoxically, the only place that this election worked for Theresa May was in Scotland. So here's where things get complicated. The UK's EU withdrawal bill has just voted through the latest stage in Parliament. If you're following the controversy there, we have a massive issue with what's seen as a power grab by the UK government. That's in three different areas. A power grab for ministers to make laws, a power grab for the Tories to run committees. All of this is happening as we speak. My Twitter is twitching. But also, from both a Scottish and a Welsh perspective, a power grab on areas that they thought were already devolved. Food, agriculture, fishing are all areas that both Scotland and Wales thought were devolved. And so the Scottish Government's position and the Welsh Government's position and a Labour UK attempt to change the law are all that areas that we thought were devolved should go straight to the Scottish Parliament, should go straight to the Welsh Parliament, and so on, which the UK Government has not seen to allow. So when Paul was talking about 2,000 laws in food and drink that might be different in the UK post-Brexit, what you also need to factor in is they might be different in Scotland, they might be different in England, and they might be different in Wales and Northern Ireland as well. So you've just multiplied that complexity by 4. And that is a significant worry for most of the food and drink companies that I represent. But it will also be a significant worry, I think, if you're exporting into these markets. And this fragmentation of the UK market is certainly not what those who voted for Brexit suggested might happen, but it's very clearly an opportunity for the Scottish Parliament and others to assert some sovereignty in some of the areas that they already felt they were doing. And for example, if I were a Scottish parliamentarian, I would be thinking very carefully about country of origin labelling and how you might emphasise Scottish ingredients and Scottish manufacture there. So these are big things that we need to watch out for. As we speak, the Scottish Parliament there's being statements made in the Scottish Parliament. They're not willing to put the Brexit bill to a vote at the moment, and they're seeking to make amendments to the UK bill to reflect some of their huge concerns about further devolution of power. So, it's complicated. Some causes for optimism. The cap system, as many of you will know, is broken, at least in terms of the UK. Surely we should be able to deliver the flexibility to deliver a better common agricultural policy within the UK, one that works and is more agile for farmers. As has been mentioned before, we do have 70 million consumers, so we're a significant economic player, and people do seem to be wanting to come and strike deals with the UK. And of course, as has been mentioned before, selling into the UK is of critical importance to Ireland and many other countries in the European Union. We've heard a lot about planning, but that adaptability is at the core of successful business, and we would expect that our businesses would be able to flex where they can. And actually, paradoxically, we're all working closer together at a UK level across the food chain to try and deliver some of the changes that we want to see. But time is very short. And of course, agriculture is very different from cars or widgets. There are higher tariffs. Why? Because agriculture is at the heart of many nations' ideas of itself. Very much so in Scotland, very much so in Ireland, very much so in many of the European countries. And we have more time-sensitive supply chains. Political dimensions don't mean common sense, as we all know. And as I've said, Scotland and Wales have the opportunity to make politics and indeed further regulation more difficult for people. And we see in the Food and Drink Federation as Ireland as a critical test case for people and for businesses, as well as for rules and regulations. We've pulled together a task force on Ireland as part of our EU exit work, and we've offered that support from businesses to the UK government to help them understand this angle. And some kind of important truths about Brexit, I think. It is a political and not an economic negotiation. And that means there are deeply held principles and some deep distrust of compromise on both sides. Some in the UK think it's worth bearing some economic pain to be free of the European Union. And some in the European Union think it is worth bearing some economic pain to show that leaving the EU is not desirable to other member states who wish to do so. We're seeing already that the government is struggling to get its Brexit legislation passed. Okay, it's passed some stages over the past couple of days, but there is a whole world of pain for the Tories to come, particularly actually in the House of Lords, where there's no majority and there are no standing orders. We know that resolving future trade with the EU, particularly around food and agriculture, is going to be 100 times more difficult than people realise. It's not insoluble, just very, very difficult, and those 2,000 regulations are an important part of that. I think some other truths are, what we've seen from the UK government over a while is in the papers that they've delivered on workforce, on the European Court of Justice, on a wide range of things. They've stated a desired outcome there from the negotiations, but it's a long way from securing any of those outcomes for both sides, actually. And time is very short. We've just over a year to agree everything before any deal goes to the 27 member states for ratification and possibly to their regional assemblies too. So time is ridiculously short, and the UK government have not really got their act in order, possibly until now, on some of the key issues. It will be an asymmetric negotiation. It won't be about food alone. It will be you don't get a deal on your BMWs unless I get a deal on free movement of people. So all of that is very, very complicated, and the complications around food are just a small part of a multiple negotiation there. And of course, in negotiation, as I learned, one of my previous jobs, I used to work for government negotiating the general practitioner's contract, and the key principle of that, and the key principle of any negotiation, is nothing is agreed until it's all agreed. And so right up until the last moment, any gains that you think you have made will be of high dubiety in terms of the overall package, and there are lots of bumps in the road to go. So what do we want? Well, we still want to be seamlessly connected to our biggest export and import markets. That's the European Union by a long way. We still want to have new opportunities to access high quality ingredients and raw materials, and that might mean trade with people outside the EU to allow us to deliver that. We want the UK still to be a beacon for providing consumers with a wide range of high quality, safe and affordable food at all price points. We want to be able to feed the nation healthy, sustainably and safely. We want the best talent in the world to work in the food and drink industry in the UK, it already does. We want to retain that and make sure we're driving ourselves forward. And we want to be free to operate and innovate without undue regulatory burdens. And that means from the UK government, from the Scottish government, from the countries that we export to. So hopefully that's the life that we can see there. I hope I've given you an insight into what the UK food and drink industry wants. I hope I've given you a bit of an insight into the complexities of politics, and in particular around the Scottish Parliament. But I hope you'll see that we're working very, very hard to try and deliver this kind of future for the UK industry and for our partners in the EU. Thank you very much.